One author, if I could, one author said that all of the electronics that we have in the internet gives us the sense of omniscience, but we lack the omnipotence to deal with all those problems. So we're very much aware of the problems, but we can do nothing about them.
Welcome to the BJU Press Teacher Edition podcast, where Christian educators are encouraged and inspired as we bring you interviews, practical ideas, strategies, and answer your questions about teaching in today's culture. And here's your host, Jenny Copeland.
When we look out over a class of students, we're looking not just at young people coming looking for what they can take away from the day. We're looking into the faces of young people who are bringing something to the day. For some, they come from a structured, traditional family, void of financial struggles or conflicts. Life is good. But for the most part, those students are going to be bringing something emotionally to the day. For some, it's the uncertainty of who might be there at the end of the day in light of a relational situation at home. For others, it's anger over a rule, a person, maybe an interaction. For some, it's fatigue, while others just slip effortlessly into their own little world in their minds. One other element that might be something that students bring to the table, actually that is something that students are bringing to the table, is fear or anxiety. And I'm not just speaking of the older students. More and more, we are seeing students of all ages plagued by fear. Founded or unfounded, they are daily living out their lives fearfully. How can we help these children? Anyone who's worked with children or has been a parent knows the fruitlessness of telling them there's nothing to be afraid of. We've tried the distraction techniques, maybe even bribes, just to get them through the moment. But how do we genuinely help them? How do we understand them and their fears? We're going to talk about this and so much more in this week's episode of the Teacher Edition podcast. I'm so glad you're joining in. And I don't say that robotically. I really do appreciate our listeners. As educators, we give and give and give, and there are few things more refreshing than just having our own cups refilled sometimes. Our heart is to bring you a podcast where you walk away encouraged, and hopefully you also walk away with some really great ideas. As we get started with another episode, let me take just a minute to remind you to share this podcast out with anyone who you know who might not be listening. Let's continue to see this podcast grow. We can't be a blessing to Christian educators if they don't know that the podcast is out there. So we really appreciate it anytime that you can share the show with others. Don't forget to visit us on social media. We are Teacher Edition Podcast on Facebook, and on Instagram and TikTok, we are Teacher Edition Pod. Please also take a minute to subscribe to the podcast. That way you won't miss any of our episodes. And don't forget, you can also visit us on YouTube where you can watch these episodes as well. One last reminder, and that's to go to our website, teachereditionpodcast.com. We have a regular newsletter that goes out, and you can sign up for it there on our website. Of course, there's more information about the show and, of course, about our top-notch guests, as well as an area where you can share a question with us. We have had some questions come in, and we're going to be bringing those into some of our upcoming episodes. Okay, I'm really excited to unpack today's topic a bit more. On this podcast, we talk reality, and fear is a reality among our students. Another reality is that we're privileged to have yet another incredible guest with us today. I'm really honored to welcome Dr. Bruce Meyer onto the show. Bruce has been in education since 1993. He served as a faculty member, school administrator, assistant pastor, and a pastor. He and his wife, Kathy, they have 4 children and 4 grandchildren. He has been on the faculty of 2 great Christian universities, and he's currently serving as a professor here of Biblical World Studies and Counseling. There are a lot of voices speaking into our lives and into the lives of our students today. And I'm just so grateful for people like Bruce, who's speaking the truth in love, who's speaking the power of the gospel, the power of God and his word into the lives of young people and old people alike. I'm just so thankful for the opportunity to have people like Bruce on the show. And Bruce brings a wealth of experience in counseling, so I'm really looking forward to talking about fear today. Bruce, I really appreciate your time and your willingness to be with us. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Jenny. It's great to be with you, and I look forward to discussing this topic with your listeners.
I do too. So as I mentioned in the opener, our students are facing a lot today. They're bringing much to the classroom. And today I want to unpack that topic of fear and anxiety among young people. As we often do on the podcast, let's start with defining the terms. As much as you would think that everyone is on the same page of what fear is, I really don't think we can assume that because we are all influenced by our own experiences, our own personal tolerance thresholds, our personalities. So what is fear? We are in a time of year where people are putting out scary decorations. They're participating in things that intentionally scare people as if they thrive on being scared or being afraid. Is that what we're talking about, Bruce? What would you say? What is fear?
Well, certainly there are times that fear gives us an adventure. I'm a huge fan of roller coasters, so I love things like that. But the world would often locate fear within just chemical reactions within the brain, and there might be truth to those chemical reactions. But the scriptures would locate this within the image of God in us, that He has put emotion and thoughts are the way we think and the way we choose within the image of God that He has put within us. And so I would define emotion as an emotional response that involves cognition, the way I'm thinking about my environment, the way that I'm thinking about circumstances, but emotional response to perceived danger. And so it may not be a real danger, it might be something phony. So you walk outside to take the trash out and you're seeing a shadow that spooks you, but there's nothing there. It's just a branch that's maybe waving. So, but it is perceived danger that may or may not be real.
Yeah, that makes sense. So typically we're told to stop being afraid, to push past it, to just get over it. Don't be afraid. But I wonder if you can shed light on that. So are all fears bad? Are there good fears? What do you think?
Well, certainly if we consider life, God has given to us some good fears that are protective. If I'm in a threatening situation, that fear can cause me either to move very quickly, to flee, or to defend myself. So there are good fears. And I use the example of climbing a ladder. If you're climbing a ladder to a second story window, that fear is actually going to help you become a little more cautious and not do something stupid on that ladder. So it can be protective, but it can also be preventative in the bad sense of preventing me from doing God's will. So we've got to consider both sides of that. And there is good fear and there's also some bad fears. I would define bad fear as anything that keeps us from doing God's will.
So, a biblical worldview is a pillar of our podcast, and you're already bringing that in, and I love that. So, I just want to be sure that we continue right along that, even here from the start. So, since there is good fear and there's bad fear, I'm guessing that it's safe to assume there's biblical fear and unbiblical fear. So, kind of following along those same lines, how could we identify unbiblical fear? What would you say?
Well, working off the statement I just gave you is anything that prevents me from doing God's will. So we're called to be lights that are shining in this world of the gospel and the glory of Christ. And if my fear prevents me now from sharing the truth of the gospel with someone who is near me, that's an unbiblical fear. If I'm not bold enough to correct my children or to share truth with them that they need to hear to work through a particular problem, and I ignore that, then I'm not accomplishing God's will in my life or in theirs. And so I think what we can differentiate is anything that is hindering me from doing something that is loving towards others, that is sharing with them the love of Christ or loving discipline, then I am interfering with God's plan for my life and for theirs. And so that's an unhealthy, unbiblical fear.
Wow, that's great. I love how you put that. That's just very clear and succinct. So, as I mentioned right from the start of the podcast, students are bringing fear to the table, to the classroom more and more. Even as a teacher and as a principal, I remember just seeing over and over there are more and more behaviors that were very closely even just with a little bit of digging, they were identified as stemming from some type of fear in that child. As a child, I never remember hearing about something called panic attacks, but now they just seem to be so commonplace. Bruce, in your experience, what are you seeing? What's contributing to that rise? Do you see society as contributing to that fear that we're seeing this in young people so much more?
There are probably a lot of factors involved in this, Jenny, but certainly the news media, the world affairs, and the quick access to information is contributing to a lot of those fears. I have followed over the years asking students what are they fearful of. And I have seen even with Student Life Office, they tell me there are more and more of those panic attacks, more and more anxiety, more and more fear. And even with the COVID crisis, that certainly exacerbated the problem of fear and anxiety in so many. And I think in part because they were isolated through that experience as well. And so fear is on the rise. Panic attacks are something that are relatively new, probably within the last 15 to 20 years, I would say, in my experience, is when I've seen them rising. And prior to that time, we had never heard of it. If I'd asked somebody a panic attack, they would have said, "What do you mean by that?" And so we do need to talk about what is that and how do we handle those panic attacks, because chances are now your audience, your teachers have probably a handful of students, depending upon the size of their class, that will have symptoms of panic attacks. And they're frightening to us because we're not sure what to do with those.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I do want to dig into that more. I love that you pointed out just the constant deluge of news. Even as adults, how many times do we hear somebody say, I just can't watch the news? I just have to
Right.
walk away, because it is so much, and it just weighs on your mind, that constant tsunami of information. Even students with constantly on phones and connected and
Right.
all that I love how you pointed that, because that is so true. That is on the rise, and it's amazing how many other things are on the rise because of that. Okay, so let's go back to
One author, if I could, one
Absolutely.
author said that all of the electronics that we have in the internet gives us the sense of omniscience, but we lack the
Interesting.
omnipotence to deal with all those problems. So we're very much aware of the problems, but we can do nothing about them.
Wow, that's fantastic. That is so true. You can see why we're stressed and
Right.
fearful. That's right.
Right.
Okay, so let's keep along the vein here of panic attacks. Maybe we can park there just for a minute longer if you don't mind. Shed some light on panic attacks. You started into just a little bit. We hear that term, it's loosely used. Actions are sometimes loosely labeled as, oh, that was a panic attack. But what are they? And maybe as a part B to that, how do you deal with them? Because our default responses are typically not effective in a true scenario. So
Yeah,
what is
just
that? What do
telling
you
them
say?
calm down.
That's right. That's
no,
right.
that
That'll
just
fix
makes
it.
it worse, right? So panic attacks are very physiologically based. And what happens is if you have somebody who has a particular fear, and they may not even know what the trigger is for that fear, but they feel those feelings of fear, and then the physiology starts to move in, and doctors will tell you that a panic attack is nothing more than hyperventilation. Now, I'm careful because if I'm working with somebody who's older who is struggling with panic attacks, I do want them to go to the doctor and get the heart checked out, make sure that everything is okay. But if the heart is fine, then what we're dealing with is hyperventilation. And one of the articles that was so influential in my thinking was it just said if you can get their breathing under control, which is hyperventilation, they're breathing too rapidly and too shallowly. If you can get that under control, the symptoms will disappear. So, what the panic attack is actually now, if you follow the wording here, it becomes fear of the fear. So I've got this initial fear, and now I'm fearful of the feelings that I'm feeling as a response to that fear. So it's fear of the fear, it's panic over those feelings. I don't want people to see me in this panic. So they're sweating, their cold, clammy skin, their breathing is rapid and shallow, their heart is racing, they feel nauseated, and they now fear people seeing them with this fear. So it just snowballs into an avalanche for them. So the remedy is, and it may sound simplistic, but doctors will say if you can get that breathing under control. So what I do, because I can't do the spiritual counsel that I need to until the body gets out of the way. So I have my counselees who are struggling with panic attacks. You just go to their phone, they can download an app that is called the breathing app. And there are probably other apps out there that do the same thing, but that's the one that I'm familiar with. It's free. And all it is a rubber ball. And you watch the rubber ball as it expands, you breathe in, as it contracts, you breathe out. And it's 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. And if counselees will remember to open the app, because quite often they'll say, yeah, I forgot to open the app. If they'll remember to open the app and be vigilant in just following that breathing pattern, very quickly the physiological symptoms start to disappear. Then we can deal with the spiritual, emotional side with scripture and some prayer and help them overcome some of those fears.
Wow, that's great insight and a good resource too. So
It
let's
is.
keep following that a little bit further. This is likely not a clear-cut line in the sand to wander into, but I would love your insights. How to separate out the physical symptoms from the spiritual issues? Where is that line? Is there a line? What's your take on that?
Whatever line is there is probably somewhat fuzzy, because the spiritual, my emotions and what I believe about God, what I believe about my environment, about my own safety, that's going to feed into the physical. And then that loop begins there, where that physical is now going to give feedback that intensifies my beliefs and so on. And so I'm not sure I can always draw that line in a hard, fast way, but I don't have to, because if I can get the physical under control, so let's get the body out of the way, as I like to say it, then let's deal with truth that speaks to your heart, and I'm going to do that very gently. Is all fear sinful? Well, I've already mentioned, if it keeps me from doing God's will, now we're in a dangerous territory. But the fearful feelings, I don't think we can go to Scripture and say those are sinful. So climbing the ladder, those fearful butterflies, or you're giving a speech and you feel the butterflies, that in and of itself is not sinful, unless I give into that fear and I don't give the speech when I'm supposed to. I'm not commanded to climb ladders, so if I say I'm not doing that, I'm going to call a painter to do that. No worries there. But I do have to think through, what is God calling me to do? What has He clearly said I must do in the Word? And if I'm not doing that, now I've entered the arena of sinfulness. And so separating those out, I'm not sure I have to, but I can say, here's where God always takes us. And I love the fact that when you read the Gospels, the disciples were fearful. And they
True.
have
Very
Jesus with
true.
them. It's like,
Yes.
how can that be? Well, they hadn't quite learned all of His power yet.
Right.
And they were seeing firsthand. And He would often say to them, don't be fearful. Now, He's not saying stop fearing. What He is saying is don't be fearful. Rather, trust, believe, only believe. Or you've got me in the boat with you. So why are you so fearful about this? What He's calling them to do is recognize truth that will alleviate those fears and realize, oh boy, as long as I'm with Jesus, I'm absolutely safe.
I like how you point out that very clear threshold. It's one thing to be fearful, but when we cross that threshold into not doing what we're supposed to, not doing what God wants us to do, that's when we cross over that threshold and the whole situation changes. I love how you keep reiterating that, because I think that's something we need to remember when we're dealing with fear, is
Right.
what it's driving us to do doesn't give us an excuse or a golden ticket or a pass just because we're fearful. And I think that's
Correct.
great that you keep emphasizing that. So let's just go on this panic attack line just a little bit further. So the reality is that physically there is a lot going on there, and potentially there's a lot at stake. So talk with us about addressing the physical issues of panic attacks and how we should approach that. You mentioned it a little bit with the breathing and the ball. Is there anything else you can add to that? Because in a classroom, when a student is having a panic attack or we're heading into that, what are some practical things that teachers can do?
Sometimes doctors will say, if you can just establish kind of a normal walking. So it might be that you take the student out in the hallway, and let's just hand in hand, maybe, if that's appropriate, but we just walk down the hallway and check out what's going on down here and come back, and that restores normal breathing. The harder the person resists the feelings, the worse they get. And this is why the loop that I mentioned to you. So if it's, I'm doing this and I'm saying, okay, don't panic, don't panic. All I'm doing is feeding that fear even more.
Right.
Instead, I need to really shift my focus away. So, moving to some spiritual truths, the two truths that bring the most comfort to my heart and many others is the fact that I will never leave you nor forsake you. So, Jesus is with us, and He is interceding for us, Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15. So He's praying for me. So I've got those assurances, and whatever the trigger is right now, so let's say it's, I am supposed to perform a solo, a recital, or I'm supposed to give a speech. Well, okay, this is temporary. In 5 minutes, whatever the speech is, this is over, but focus on your message that you're supposed to deliver through this speech. So you want them to be focusing on truth. That's what I focus on. But let's try to restore that body stability first, and then we'll focus on those truths. Typically, that's what I do, the approach I take.
Okay, so the $1,000,000 question. What about medication? So today we're surrounded by calming items, calming scents, calming supplements. I know every situation is different, and individuals obviously need to follow the direction of their own doctor. But generally speaking, can you shed light on any of that when it comes up to the helpfulness of medication?
I'm the wrong kind of doctor to say yes or no to meds. I do caution, though, folks about meds because they don't always work. And doctors will say, we're not sure what's causing fear. That's why when you look at the commercials about some of these medications, they can be used for almost anything, whether it's social anxiety disorder or depression or post-traumatic stress, you name it. The same medication works for all these. So they don't really know what's going on with the chemicals. They seem to help some people, but some they don't. Sometimes it's a dosage issue, so adjusting the dosage helps them. There are often side effects, though, that sometimes are worse than what the medication or the problem that prompted the medication. So I caution folks, but I tell them ultimately this is your decision, no guilt, no shame. Because if there are physical issues involved, medications might be helpful. Notice my wording there. So I'm not going to shame them into not taking them or taking them either way. That's between them and their doctor. I will monitor carefully, though, to make sure that they're not getting worse, because some of those medications can actually move folks closer to suicidal ideation, etc. So I issue cautions, but I don't prescribe. I don't tell them to go off those meds. That's between them and their doctor. If they're thinking that they need to adjust meds, I say, then go back to your doctor and talk to him about that. They might move you to something else or reduce or increase dosage, but that's really the doctor's call on that. And I get concerned when people are shaming folks for using medications, but I understand the sentiment there also, understanding that it can make things worse.
Yeah, excellent insights. Dr. Meyer, this is great. These are topics that we need to stop and think about. We need to give intentional focus to as educators. Okay, so we have a lot more to cover, and I really want to talk about the difference between feelings and thoughts, walking young people through fearful moments, even habits of fearful people. Our time is gone for today, but we're going to pick up here next time on the Teacher Edition podcast. Dr. Bruce Meyer will be back with us, and listeners, we will see you then. Don't miss out.
All right. Thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you were challenged and encouraged as I definitely was. Remember to go to Teacher Edition Podcast to submit questions for upcoming episodes. Of course, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media. Now, it's time to get back to your day. But it's not just any day. Every day in the classroom is your day to impact and inspire through God's power and His grace working in you. Go do what God has called you to do.